Good evening, everyone. My name is Dean Maines, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event on behalf of its sponsors, the John A. Ryan Institute for Catholic Social Thought, the Hebiger Institute for Catholic Leadership, and the Veritas Institute, which is the institute that I lead. The Higher Calling series was initiated by this trio of organizations in the year 2009 to help illuminate the moral challenges that confront contemporary leaders within a variety of organizations. And the Higher Calling series uses the experience of executives as a departure point for reflection and conversation on the resources that leaders can employ to help their organizations address in an ethical and effective manner a number of moral quandaries and issues. These resources include such things as the virtues, such as courage and practical wisdom, the insights and the moral traditions of particular religious communities, and then also systematic frameworks for moral discernment and moral deliberation. Now, tonight's gathering is the fourth in the Higher Calling series. The first three events have focused upon such issues as the moral dilemmas that face entrepreneurs, the special issues that confront executives who lead religiously based institutions, such as institutions of healthcare and institutions of education, and also the challenge of serving as a faithful leader in the face of crises and dilemmas that confront or threaten the very existence of an organization. Now, in these past events, we found that the exchanges within this forum have not only catalyzed learning and insights, but have also led to a set of collaborations between organizations here at St. Thomas and a variety of for-profit and not-for-profit firms. So these exchanges, these events have been quite fruitful. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I want to thank you for making time in your very busy schedules to be with us. I'm confident that our proceedings this evening will be as engaging as the prior events in the Higher Calling series. And I want to start things off by introducing our moderator for this evening, my dear friend and colleague, Michelle Rovang-Burke. Michelle is a graduate both of the University of Notre Dame and the University of St. Thomas. She has served as the director of the Veritas Institute since August of 2008. And Michelle has also enjoyed a varied career. She's been active in broadcast journalism. She's been nationally recognized for her work in public relations and organizational communications. She's also been an executive in the field of healthcare with the Inova system in Northern Virginia. So Michelle, I will turn things over to you. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Rovang-Burke.
Thank you, Dean. And my job description is I do what Dean tells me to do, and then we argue about it later. It's perfect. Thank you for joining us this evening. As part of our ongoing Higher Calling series, we basically use the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace's vocation of the business leader, a reflection, as the springboard for the basis of this evening. And we're excited to have you use that document and hear our speakers this evening as we have a provocative conversation about things that really matter. In the document, it states, when businesses and market economies function properly and focus on serving the common good, they contribute greatly to the material and even the spiritual well-being of the society. Recently, however, we've also seen the harm caused by the failures of such businesses. The benefits of globalization, communications technologies, and financialization have also produced problems, as we all know, ranging from inequality to economic dislocation, information overload, financial instability, and many other pressures that interfere with serving really the common good. Nonetheless, this evening we're going to put some of those aside and suggests that business leaders who are guided by ethical social principles, live through virtues, and illuminated for Christians by the gospel, can succeed and contribute to the common good. These leaders will face many obstacles, as many of you in the room know. Many obstacles to the common good, perhaps most significant on a personal level, is leading a divided life. And we all have that. As I drove my car into the parking lot and took a call from my 8-year-old son, this split between faith and daily business practice can lead to imbalances and sometimes misplaced devotion to worldly success. Tonight, we will feature the views of 3 thought leaders who will challenge us to lead boldly and find meaning in a time of great challenges. In order to cultivate the table discussion, we've changed the evening structure a bit. So in your program, we list our panelists as speaking after the meal. We're going to make you wait to eat. We will be having our panel discussion, or our actual panelists share their thoughts before the meal, and then break into a discussion at your table. First, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Pierre Lecocq. A lead contributor to the pontifical document Vocation of the Business Leader, Mr. Lecocq has extensive international experience in the automotive industry in a variety of engineering and senior management positions in the United States and France. He also shared with me he went to Harvard Business School with 2 of presidential type folks, George W. Bush and Mitt Romney. In 2002, Mr. Lecocq was appointed CEO of Energy Automation Systems, Automotive Systems, a major global supplier of fuel and emission control systems to car manufacturers. Before joining Energy, he was the chairman and CEO of a large European printing service supplier. Since hitting Energy's organization, Mr. Lecocq has played a major role in strengthening his company's leading position as a plastic fuel system supplier. He's the current president of UNIAPAC, International Christian Union of Business Executives, which features 30 associations of 16,000 Christian executives from Europe, Latin America, and Africa. Mr. Lecocq did graduate in mechanical engineering from ENSAM Paris, France, and as I said, completed his Master of Economic Science and then his MBA from Harvard University. Mr. Lecocq began his career as an engineer for Renault, continuing his career path with Alcatel and then with Valeo. A gracious and humble leader, I will tell you he did boast of his 40-year marriage, 2 married children, and 3 marvelous grandchildren with a 4th in progress. Mr. Lecocq, please join us this evening.
Michel told me that French people were supposed to be small, so I have to adjust that. Good evening to all. Mike Norton, with whom I worked on that paper and whom I had met in Rome before, gave me quite a difficult task for tonight. Somehow I'm supposed to make links between my career of almost 40 years, the values I developed over these years, my faith, and the paper on the vocation of business leader of justice and peace, to which I modestly participated. On top of it, and the largest challenge is to do that in English, for which I really beg your forgiveness. I tried, it's very difficult to sum up 40 years of a career in a few minutes, so I tried to pick up what I really consider the episode of my career that really formatted my values as of today. And I would say probably the most significant one has been in my early career, after indeed the business school at Harvard, and I was probably one of the very few Harvard graduates doing that. I started my career in the factories. I was a plant manager for about 7 years. But before that, during my studies in France, I took a number of summer jobs as a worker in different factories to finance my studies and my leisure times. This meeting of the working world, although limited, has definitively determined most of my vision of man in enterprises. The working conditions, the small chief's attitude, the absence of information, the trade unions' incomprehension of small problems that remained unsolved for days and months. Still today, I cannot walk in a factory without certain memories coming back to me, generating the strong will to avoid this situation in the operation placed under my responsibility. Two anecdotes as an illustration. One of those summer jobs, I was working in a factory that we were basically remodeling, and I was as a worker working in the beams somehow high in the ceiling of that rooms, and that beams was full of, let's call it shit. I mean, there's no other words I can use, and I was myself covered of it. And suddenly I saw three guys, probably with this kind of white shirt and so on, passing by. And I had the strong envy of just pushing that shit just on top of them when they were passing under me. And I mean, you have to feel that, because that's exactly what many of our workers put in such condition would feel. Or arriving very early in the morning in the cloak room and having to go in those places which with oil odors and humidity and put those blue clothes which are dirty and humid and full of odors. Again, today when I walk through my factories and they know about it, I made the point always to visit the cloak rooms. And that tells you a lot about the way the management is taking care of its people in the factories. Small anecdote, I was in China 4 years ago buying a company, and I visited the factory in Wuhan, middle of China, a very dirty factory. And at one point, I asked the local manager and the guy from Beijing that was with me that I had to go to a place where I couldn't delegate, and they asked me to go to the office building. I said, no, I want to go where your workers are going. And I went there. And I can tell you, I stopped the visit immediately and said, I'm not interested in your company. If you are treating these people the way you're treating them, I'm not interested. Went back to Beijing two days later, and I was meeting the president of one of the largest organization of the Communist Party that holds probably 700 companies, and that company was part of it. And he had been informed that I have refused to discuss the future of this company because the cloakroom was dirty. And this guy was surprised and asked me why. I said, well, because you don't respect your people, and I'm not interested. And, you know, that's coming from these early years of my career. This experience really ingrained in me the sensitivity to the respect of the person on the floor. It was not the consequence of a logical thought process, but just a strong deep-down feeling and reaction. I just could not accept to be treated as such, feeling a strong sense of disrespect and thus not accepting it for the others. 7 years as plant manager in 2 factories followed my return from the US. The first factory, 200 people, which I had to reorganize, reorient on new product. I had a long strike. All the employees were women. And I can tell you, women in strike, it's a difficult bunch to get back to work. And particularly when, as a plant manager, I was 29 years old, and they really wanted to get me down. Then a factory of 1,200 people in Bordeaux, very strongly unionized with leftist union, numerous social conflict, or reorganization, scaled down again. Things I remember from my time as a plant manager, the morning walking tour. I used to go to the factory at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and for about 2 hours, I would just tour the different workshops. And I had my black small books where I would note things to be done. And the pleasure and responsibility you feel to discuss with the employees and to fix the small problems, the problems they have to deal with every day, which they are not able to fix. By the way, that was a way for me also to get the unions out. It was not on purpose, but the reaction was that because I was, and the management through me, was treating their small problems. And after a lot of strikes, when I moved from that company, after I'd been in charge of the division which was responsible for the factory, the management of the factory asked me to have a sort of farewell party before I left. So I went back to Bordeaux, and they had organized it. And 2 days before, my secretary came to me and said, "Sir, the unions want to have a drink with you before you leave." I said, "Okay." So we had the drink, and I had all the union people, and unions in France are a little bit different from union in the US, and probably much more aggressive and politically oriented. And the leader of the most leftist union, a guy of about 35 years old, quite aggressive, came to me and just offered me a present, which I still have. He was at the maintenance department. He had prepared that with a couple of notes on it, and said, "We had a lot of fun, sir." I said, "Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no." But I was very touched by the fact that when you respect people, somehow they respect you. And you can get a lot of things out of them. So those 7 years were humanly very rich and formative. The practical experience that respect of the person and effectiveness are not a zero-sum game, as too often people think. What you give to the respect of people is not something you take out of profit. As a matter of fact, the more you respect, the more you demand, and the more you get. And that's something you have always to remember. And as a general rule, you have the trade unions and the social climate you deserve. And I think also that's something we have to remember permanently. But to sum up those years, and I'm seeing a lot of young people here around, plant manager, and I know in the US it's not exactly the things where people wants to go, but I can tell you, plant manager for a young manager is probably the most beautiful job you can dream of from a human perspective. You get things done, you meet people, you can fix their issues, and you can see you are really useful. And that's probably the job where you can experience, indeed, the way to respect people when you are in management. Second part of my life has been on the international side. I do run today a very international company. I was saying at the meeting before that although we are a French company, my activity in France is only 7% of the total activity of the group. Europe is only 40%, 30% here in North America, 30% in Asia, a little bit in South America and South Africa. So it's a very international company. And for me, the world has always been something I had very strongly in me. When I was a young guy, I had in my room at my parents' home an Air France poster of the 50s with planes and the world. I still have it in my personal office at home, and I used to be dreaming about the world that I wanted to know. In 1984, I was promoted as division vice president within, at the time, the largest French group, Alcatel. My division was the world leader. We were manufacturing nickel-cadmium batteries. Was established in France, Spain, UK, US, and Japan. Its span was the world and was run by a very international team. I just enjoyed getting these multicultural teams to work together, but measured also the limit of a group, Alcatel, whose at the time the management was still very Franco-French and didn't totally understand what it means to run a truly international company. 4 years later, I joined Valeo, a French leading automotive component group, as vice president of the engine cooling branch, at the time a $700 million turnover, result of 2 successive international mergers. This disparate unit represented 22 factories, was present in Europe, Americas, and Asia. On paper, these additions made of it the world leader. A huge work had to be done to create a real unit worldwide through a strong emphasis on people empowerment in a group who was led at the time by a man that was very well known in France for his efficiency, but who basically didn't believe in man. And I had a lot of discussion with him. I worked for him 7 years. Structurally, ontologically, he didn't believe in man. He considered man as untrustful, and that you had to basically, they were usable materials. Obviously, you realize I didn't agree with him. And I had a lot of discussion and fight with him, even at the management committee. And he used to call me his idealist. One day, I asked him, but sir, it's not a problem for you to have an idealist in your management team running your main branch. And he bluntly told me, no problem, Pierre, as long as you have results. And I think that's also a lesson, a very important lesson. Respect for man is not an alibi for not being effective. On the contrary. And when you believe in it, you have to stand up for it, and you get the result, and you get the respect for what you're doing. Then a more difficult part of my, which so far has been quite successful career, I had a period which was much more difficult. Indeed, I bought a company with a venture capital group through an LBO, a printing company. 8 years adventure, which ended in a bankruptcy. The leverage buyout had been too much leverage, and at one point we had to face the fact. It's a very painful experience, but humanly also very rich, even if I certainly don't advise you to go through that. I did learn a couple of basic business lessons. I don't know if there is a business school student here, but things which I didn't really learn at Harvard at the time, like turnaround should never solve your problem. Turnaround should never be solved by growth. In fact, you have to fix your break-even point and get the growth after it. Don't go for growth to fix internal problem. Fix the problem first. Then the venture capital attitude, no good money and bad money. Never go back to your shoulder if they are venture capitalists to ask them to put more money in the company because you want to turn it around. They won't do it. I had to go through 2 fundraising, but most of it, I learned that the company never died by its P&L. it dies by its bank account. It seems simple, but it's true. And cash is king in a company, and that's something you also have always to remember. This is management and business. But more important, as a person, I lived the personal experience of my limits as a human being. The experience of the fact that lying is sometimes the only possible way out. When you are the leader of a company that is on the verge of bankruptcy, you just cannot tell the truth. You have to accept that neither to your family, nor your collaborator, your shareholder, your banker, your supplier, your customer, you can tell them the exact truth. You are alone with yourself. You must arbitrate permanently between the harsh reality of your bank account and the will to find a solution which requires keeping going. And if you have to keep the trust of all the shareholders and their belief you're going to be successful, which means you cannot tell the truth. And I could give you a couple of anecdotes of what I had to do to go through that. And I lived that very badly, because clearly it's not something I like to do. A priest friend of mine helped me by making me realizing that I was reaching my limits as a human being. He taught me that human beings have basically 3 levels of conscience. The socialized conscience, which is a concept of good and evil received from your family education and your social background. When you transgress that conscience, you generate a guilt feeling with respect to the others. Then there is a cerebral conscience, the one that you acquire at adolescence, which are the rules you give yourself for your life. Failure generates guilt feeling with respect to yourself. You are disappointed of yourself. But more deep down, you have the deep conscience, the conscience at the deep heart of ourself, which expresses the deep aspiration of the human being to be in conformity with good and with the good of all persons. It's a realistic conscience, which not only holds account to the person as such, but also of the person in situation. Failure with the deep conscience do not generate guilt feeling, but a feeling of responsibility with a peaceful regret. One feels poor, limited, not depressed, nor guilty. In such a case, we simply realize that we have limits, we are not gods. As Christians, we know also that this is where we actually meet God. Finally, since 2002, Energy. Energy was created in 2000 by the merger of 2 competitors. I took over mid-2002. Energy is a Tier 1 automotive supplier which design, manufacture, and sell the fuel system which equipped your vehicles. We equipped about 1 car out of 5 in the world. Result of a merger, it was necessary to build a new specific culture. The product per se is technically rich, but not very sexy. So with my HR VP, which I recruited, we chose to build the culture of this company on its international specificity. A project called In Together made it possible to redefine all the administrative and technical processes through transfunctional but especially transnational groups. This work then evolved on the formalization of the values and behaviors which bonded us internationally and of the HR practices which would make them live. It is at Energy that I try to deploy a management built on subsidiarity principle. This mode of management, which goes well beyond delegation, takes the risk of the person. I will clarify later in my presentation how this principle applies to management. Nearly 40 years of professional life with a operational responsibility cannot be summarized so simply, but by picking up those examples, I try to give you what are the episodes that really formatted me as a man and helped me through my spiritual path. Before going a little bit more into the spirituality which animate me, I'd like also to stop on 3 elements of the external aspect of companies, which as a matter of fact we used in this vocation paper to define the business context as it is today. First, globalization, which is almost a buzzword today. I insisted on the international side of my experience, but the world today is so different from the one I knew when I started my career. At the time, in the mid-70s, running an international technical business meant in terms of geographical span, West Europe without Spain, US, Canada, and that was about all. Which means we were competing on an even field, culturally and cost-wise. In the 80s, Japan emerged on the scene. Then in the early 90s, Korea, and with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the whole world opened. China became the challenger, followed by India, Brazil, ASEAN, and so on, the world we know today. This was a fantastically quick change, which nobody expected in the 80s. This globalization meant for business a tremendous change, uneven fields, culturally and cost-wise, much higher level of uncertainties, world specialization at fast pace, with very rapid shifts in the competitive scene. This was combined with the communication technology revolution well known. When I started my career again, business communication was postal mail, telephone, and telex. Decision meant paper reports, which the boss would study and send back for further information before passing it to its own boss. Then came in the 80s faxes, early 90s the cellular phone, and then internet, and look at today's means of communication. This has resulted in a tremendous acceleration of the pace of business. People expect you to react immediately. No more time for serious analysis. Most decisions are taken on the fly, even if consequence of people may be considerable. I've shut down 8 factories in the last 6 years, and I've opened 14 new factories. You wouldn't believe on what it's made. It's made on a couple of PowerPoint and basically gut feeling. Yes, I want to go. No, I don't want to go. That's how decisions are taken in business today. Globalization combined with communication technology have completely modified the business environment. Business today is 24-hour day, 7 days a week, a never-ending race. This means that business success relies much more on flexibility, agility, gut feeling and experience, vista, business acumen, you name it. All are very intangible characteristics. The paradox is that technology could allow today controlling everything. 1984 is today possible. But the same technology has also allowed human beings to be much more autonomous, much more free in an environment where intercultural understanding cannot be controlled, but relies only on interpersonal relationships. And then you have the financiarization. I don't know if that's an English word. Finance is a perfect illustration of the above point. Communication technologies have allowed the emergence of fantastically complex models and tools. Everything can be simulated and controlled. However, this is the business field where personal behaviors have had the worst consequence, not only in terms of financial crisis, but in the demands toward business at large and in the behavior within business. From all these years, if I had to sum up in a few lines my deep conviction about the business context and my own personal experience. In the business context, business more than ever require, and I've already said that, agility, reactivity, adaptability to a more than ever unpredictable and highly uncertain context. Ability to deal with foreign culture is key in a fully globalized world. Instant communication requires experience based on the fly decision. Knowledge of local context is key. Demand on business for quick fix, short-term improvement, and or short-term profit from the financial community are there to stay, as cash will remain abundant and can move so rapidly. As a person and as a CEO, my personal experience tells me that in this context, 5 points. 1, respect for the person and profit are not a zero-sum game. I will keep insisting on that. CEO have a huge impact on the culture and behavior of their company. Change the CEO and within a few months the culture change. Respect for the person is not an alibi for lesser performance. On the contrary, and you've got to believe it strongly. CEO, if they believe that, can stand up for their beliefs and push back external demand and pressure, provided they deliver. And that's the basic demand of the job. And finally, and I will now develop this in more detail, the Christian social thought has never been as well adjusted to the present context of business. All these years were, of course, marked by my Christian faith, nourished by a Christian family education, my student engagement, the sharing with my wife, who contributed much to deepen it, and with whom I still nourish it through common engagement. The bond between this personal faith and my personal life was very much built by my engagement with the CFPC, Centre Français du Patronat Chrétien, the French Christian Executive Association, which I nationally chaired from 2002 to 2006, where I militate since 1984, and then UNIAPAC. UNIAPAC is the association of the Executive Christian Association worldwide. We regroup, as it was said, 30 associations in the world with 16,000 businessmen. I found there a brotherhood which supported me much through my failed LBO period, but also through the shared continuous rereading of this professional life in teams and in the light of the social Christian thought. This rereading and this deepening enabled me not to lose the hope in a person. When you run a company, you're basically alone. And if you don't have a community with whom to share, the risk is indeed that you lose the hope in the person. I find in the Christian social thought an admirable logic to pass from the infinite love of God to the concrete aspect of the economic life. The infinite love of God is such that he calls his human creature to eventually share its divine nature. This is the foundation of the paramount dignity of the human person. 4 values, truth, freedom, justice, and peace, enlightened by faith, are the rules allowing to judge if the actions are directed toward good and to check if the dignity of man is fully respected. These values find their practical application through 6 principles, dependent between them and inseparable: common good, universal destination of goods, subsidiarity, solidarity, intermediate bodies, and participation. They are tools to study and build the world. This forms a remarkable framework to analyze the situation and constitute a perfectly coherent guide of action while leaving for each human being its capacity for understanding and freedom. Really, this structure is a fantastic tool. And if you take the time to read it and to work for the compendium or read a paper like the one we wrote, you will find in this corpus of thought a fantastic tool beside the faith that is behind all of it. Let's focus on 2 values so intrinsically dependent and whose bond rupture is the cause of so many evils of our present society and economical world: truth and freedom. Truth, it supposes the recognition of good and evil. To be true is to situate oneself compared to an objective external reference which exceeds us and is binding on us. Freedom, it confers on man his dignity under the terms of which he is put between the hands of his own judgment and becomes a master of its acts. These 2 values give all its direction and dimension to the Christian social thought. The freedom by which Christ released us pushes us to convert, to become the servants of all. In doing so, the development and liberation process concretized itself in the practice of solidarity, i.e., the love and the service of the other. We find in Sollicitudo Rei Socialis the following word, and I quote: "Where the truth and the love miss, the process of liberation leads to the death of freedom, which will have lost all support. Freedom without truth, si splendor veritatis, is hell, is the reign of the strongest on the weakest, the human person becoming a tool, a mean and not an end. It is not the very specific, is it not the very specific characteristic of our time of an economic world, which blossoms on the freedom offered by the market economy, but which has lost any transcendent reference and moved away from truth? Isn't it the base root of the financial business community excesses? Christians have there a corpus of thought marvelously adapted to understand the cause of the drift of the current world, and which gives a track to build a world for which a human person will not be any more a mean, but indeed an end. It tells us that the world community cannot thrive on the freedom given by the market economy without accepting a truth as the only way for this freedom to serve mankind. Another aspect of the Christian faith is a solid foundation for engagement in the social and economical life. It is the eminently personal aspect of the relation with God. He knows us by our name. In Isaiah 43, and I quote again, "I called you by your name, because me, the Lord, I am your God. You count much for me. You are invaluable in my eyes, and I love you. You are like engraved in the palm of my hands. I choose you, and I am with you." End of quote. Christ has always addressed himself to the person, not to the community, and even less to the system. He knows that it is the hearts which must change. This underlines an aspect too often underestimated on the personal role of business leader. As I said before, business leaders have a considerable influence on the culture and the behavior of their companies. Change the leader, and within a few months the culture and the behavior will change. It's an enormous responsibility. It is necessary to be very conscious of it. As we underline in the vocation, one reaches there the beautiful definition of charity by Benedictus XVI, love received and given. Conscience to have received in abundance leads to the desire of giving, of acting. The conscience to have received much as a business leader and to have in particular received this considerable capacity of influence on the culture and the behavior must lead us to give. In our case, to develop the mode of management which contribute to the integral development of the person, subsidiarity management, and to promote a vision of a socially responsible company, corporate social responsibility. CSR is a way to integrate company in society is well known, and we did review it at length in the vocation paper. I won't expand further on it. I would like to develop a less known application to management of one key principle of the Christian social thought, subsidiarity-based management. The principle of subsidiarity is a concept formalized by the Christian social thought initially addressing the organizations and particularly the public organization. Let me cite again the vocation paper, and I quote, "It finds its roots in the conviction that created at the image of God, the development and perfection of man imply the best possible use of its intelligence and its freedom. The dignity of the person is never respected if this intelligence and this freedom are restricted or removed unnecessarily." End of quote. Any human organization is structured in levels. The principle of subsidiarity wants that each level receive the autonomy of its decision as long as its decisions do not have an impact on a higher level of responsibility. In fact, that goes much further than the simple organizational aspect. In the name of the respect of the person, the higher level must take the risk, and I insist on that, take the risk of the autonomy and decision of the lower level. The risk of the person, key element of subsidiarity, is the key of a true respect of the person. Isn't it what God himself did in dealing with man all along the revelation? He did took the risk of our persons. We expose at length in the vocation that this principle applies perfectly to management. It indeed joins the most advanced principle of sociology, which says that for a person to engage in anything, two conditions are needed. One, to be recognized, to be liked. I am qualified, I'm recognized as such, so I'm ready to go. But the second condition is important. I want to know the rule of the game. I want to know where I'm going to engage. The second condition is as fundamental as the first one. It's not a free-for-all. The rules must be clear and a non-application sanction. It does keep an important role to well-understood control and to management. This framework of confidence remains contingent to the circumstances. Variations of the field of autonomy according to the circumstances require a constant dialogue to avoid incomprehension and ensure responsabilization. These two conditions are exactly those of subsidiarity applied to management. The responsibility for the senior rank remains strong. It must define the field of autonomy precisely. It must choose the people and take care that they are trained and that they have adapted tools. It must take the risk of the decision of its subordinate. This last point is fundamental and distinguishes subsidiarity from delegation. In delegation, I entrust a part of my power to you, but I'm here and I can take it back at any time. In subsidiarity, I give you my power in such field and give you my total trust. In delegation, the chief is visible and very much valorized. He knows. The subordinate is protected since constantly the chief can take again the power given. In subsidiarity, the chief is invisible, servant of the freedom of the subordinate, and taking the risk of the decision of his subordinate, therefore taking the risk of the person. The subordinate, on the other hand, is very much valorized and can then fully develop to the person. This principle contains a great vision for the leader. It encourages the business leader to use its power at the service of its collaborator, so that the business leader is permanently led to wonder if his or her authority serves truly the development of the employees. The chief is made servant. The most beautiful evangelical image of this attitude is the Christ at the washing of the feet of his disciples. God, knowing he is God, at the foot of our freedom. But God also gave us the rule of the game. I believe this is a true sense of servant leadership. But beside the spiritual reference, isn't this mode of management perfectly adjusted to a world which requires from companies agility, reactivity, local on-the-fly decision, ability to interface foreign culture? You just cannot get this by command and control. And I can tell you, my company is present in 20 different countries, 30 factories. I have people all over the world. There's no way, with the reactivity I'm requesting, that I can just command and control. I have to entrust the people, and I have to trust them, and I have to take the risk of the decision. Subsidiarity-based management and CSR are indeed very concrete application of the Christian social thought for business. It's not a question of an ideal to be reached, but of a daily practical application. Let's always remember that a business leader can have an ideal, but cannot be an idealist. Reality is his daily bread. Leading a company is a fascinating and beautiful job. It is an unfurling human adventure. To believe in man, to nourish one's faith, and to seek to beat Christ in this job is very exciting. This is why in the Justice and Peace paper, we did underline that being a business leader is a true vocation in the full Christian sense of the word. After nearly 40 years of very committed professional life, I remain impassioned by the human adventure of business life. My great regret, and it's going to be the end of my speech, is the public image of business, which is so distant from what I just described. Of course, each one sees by its personal prism. Of course, business is an ideal scapegoat for the politicians, particularly in Europe. Of course, medias and general public are not interested in trains which arrived on time. But as business leaders, what are we really doing to make it known as a human development place? What is the image our business schools are promoting? This is the call of the conclusion of the Justice and Peace paper. Not easy, certainly. Speaking in truth requires from business leaders to accept their weakness as men. It's not something we're really trained in it. It's also certainly necessary to go through third parties to avoid criticism or biased intention. But which ones? And do we accept to give them the necessary means? I would like to leave you on this true question from which our economic world and our society suffered so much. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lecocq. Deep appreciation for such provocative thoughts to start our evening. As I mentioned, we will now proceed with some time for our respondents before the meal. And I would like to welcome Dr. Brian Shapiro to the podium. Dr. Shapiro is Associate Professor of Accounting at the University of St. Thomas, Opus College of Business, and is a Research Fellow at the John A. Ryan Institute for Catholic Social Thought. He teaches graduate and undergraduate classes in financial accounting and co-teaches an undergraduate senior capstone course that engages students with the idea of vocation and pursuit of the common good through their chosen field with Dr. Naughton. Dr. Shapiro's research has been published in accounting, psychology, and business ethics journals. His current scholarly work examines how organizations embed their espoused values in their everyday practices, and how values-driven practices can promote effective enterprise risk management, ethical financial reporting, and meaningful work. I call him a Renaissance man. Dr. Shapiro completed his undergraduate work at the University of Minnesota with majors in Latin and ancient Near Eastern studies. He then received his PhD in business administration with a concentration in accounting and a minor in cognitive psychology. So I get worried when we talk. He is an active member and leader of Bet Shalom congregation, and I always cherish hearing Brian's thoughts that are challenging. I trust tonight will be no different. Please help me welcome Dr. Brian Shapiro.
Thank you, Michelle and Mr. Lecocq, for your provocative comments. The vocation of the business leader document and Pierre's thought-provoking account of his business experience invite us to explore how our faith traditions can transform our business activities into meaningful work that contributes to the development of persons and advances the common good. I have a few minutes to share my perspective on these issues. I'll speak from my experience as a Jewish accounting professor at this Catholic university. Let me start with the accounting piece. You might not have guessed it, but I've never been very much fascinated with numbers. I'm more intrigued by how we use our calculative techniques either to enhance or, unfortunately, sometimes diminish individual persons, organizations, and society. I'll illustrate this with some examples of how we calculate and distribute profit, and then briefly draw some implications for the integral development of whole persons, the vocation of the business leader, and hope in humanity. A Union for Reform Jewish document a Uniform for Reformed Jewish Congregations document gives advice on the relation between lay and professional leadership of Reformed Jewish congregations. And it says that counting is a metaphor for paying attention. It's not about the number. It's about the awareness that paying close attention generates. This quote, and for me also Catholic social teaching, invite me to see accounting's various roles, good and bad, in organizations and society. And it invites all of us to see a deeper reality, to see not only a company's shareholders, but also employees, the poor, the disadvantaged, and other constituents who might otherwise be invisible. In my view, however, our dominant accounting practices often prevent us from seeing this deeper reality. They also create a moral dilemma for those of us who believe in truthful reporting and in stewardship accountability. For example, earnings per share is a widely followed statistic on Wall Street. It purports to measure a company's profitability per common share. In an ideal world, earnings per share or some other suitable statistic, such as return on equity, would give us a clear measure of a manager's effectiveness and stewardship over company resources. It also would enable us to achieve a reasonable level of managerial accountability. Well, as it turns out, we accountants often aren't very good at measuring a company's net income. We often miss the mark, sometimes spectacularly so, as we did a few years ago in the subprime mortgage lending industry and on Wall Street. We miss the mark for many reasons. Our accounting estimates and judgments may be flawed. When we measure income, we ignore significant negative externalities such as pollution and job outsourcing. And some executives commit financial reporting fraud. Consequently, as we've all seen, yesterday's record profit and often justification for lavish executive compensation can become tomorrow's huge and unexpected loss and taxpayer bailout. The vocation of the business leader encourages us to find ways to reduce this risk, but this paradoxically also will unfortunately impinge on some people's autonomy. Now I turn to another important concept, that accounting practices acquire their power and persuasiveness not so much from the facts that they purport to represent, but from their place in a moral context, in a moral calculus of rights and obligations. In practical terms, after we calculate and deliver profit, we might ask, to whom should a company distribute its profit? The answer depends on our moral context. The moral calculus that tends to prevail in financial economics is that the primary purpose of business is to maximize profit or maximize shareholder wealth. And indeed, earnings per share focuses on the relation between profit and shareholders. Moreover, business law in general also gives what may be called a preferential option for the shareholder. In the extreme, from this perspective on corporate efficiency, whatever we give to other stakeholders will illegitimately diminish the shareholder's wealth. I wonder how we should view the cost of employee development, particularly when those costs will not always visibly increase company profit. But Pierre observed that respect of the person, employee development, and business effectiveness need not be viewed as a zero-sum game. Unfortunately, from my perspective, the prevailing emphasis on profit maximization does tend to treat these as a zero-sum game. It does this in part by obscuring the origins of profit and in part by disparaging the legitimacy of corporate charitable giving. Regarding the origins of profit, the founders of Google, Facebook, and Yahoo, for example, gave us valuable innovations and arguably advanced the common good. Nobody really disputes that they should be well rewarded for their effort and for their risk-taking. And still we might ask, how much should they rightfully claim for themselves? I can't give you a definitive answer, but consider how much of their success was built on resources they didn't themselves create, but rather inherited from others in our highly interdependent and global business world. This inheritance, I believe, imposes an obligation. Accounting techniques and neoclassical economic theory alone cannot answer the profit distribution question. We also need the guidance of a moral tradition. Indeed, Jewish and Catholic social traditions, among others, teach us about the ultimate origin and destination of goods and about the preferential option for the poor. Leviticus 19, for example, commands us to leave the gleanings of our fields for the poor and disadvantaged, and to love our neighbor. Of course, we no longer live in biblical times, and most of us aren't farmers. In my tradition, the ancient rabbis similarly understood that they needed to apply Leviticus 19's teachings to their more complex urban and economic societies. They understood this aspect of their vocation in part from their interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 30, where Moses is said to instruct the Israelites before they enter the promised land, when he said that it's not too hard to practice the teaching, and it's not so far up in heaven or across the sea that we should ask someone else to do it for us. This is what we mean when we say that it is our calling to apply practical wisdom from our faith traditions to our business activities, and that we should not lose hope in our own humanity. Pierre expressed the same idea when he said that his understanding of Christian social thought enabled him not to lose hope in the person. My time has run out, so to conclude, how we measure and report profit and the attention these generate can shape our ability to see profit not as an end in and of itself, but as a means to develop whole persons and advance the common good. As Mr. Lecocq quite rightly observed, business leaders can play a very important role here because they, more than anyone else, shape the tone at the top in their companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. You are a numbers guy. You were right at 10 minutes. Thank you. A scholar, oh, it was eight. A scholar and a practitioner, Dr. Daniel Dwyer, Trinity Health Senior Vice President, Mission Integration, provides leadership in preserving and nurturing the Catholic identity of Trinity Health. His focus is the integration of the mission and the core values and Catholic social teachings into the strategic plan. Dr. Dwyer's 30-year career has spanned many levels of service to health systems, hospitals, primary care clinics, long-term care facilities, medical colleges, and physician groups. Prior to his current role, Dr. Dwyer developed and implemented educational programs at the University of Michigan and taught spirituality and ethics courses for medical students and residents. He also served as an independent consultant and educator. Dr. Dwyer earned his Master of Theology in Healthcare Mission from the Aquinas School of Theology in St. Louis, as well as a master's degree in social work and Doctor of Philosophy in Urban Social Institutions from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. A client and a true friend, I'm thrilled that Dr. Dan Dwyer could join us this evening. Please welcome him.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here today and to have had the opportunity to read Pierre's paper to prepare my thoughts and reflections on his very thoughtful observations about the role of the business leader. And it's also a great pleasure to have my daughter, Nora, here, who has apparently never heard me speak publicly and, of course, hasn't listened to me a whole lot in the last 27 years. But anyway, it's good to have my daughter here as well. In my role at Trinity Health, one of the things I'm responsible for is something called Formation, which is a program that we provide in Catholic healthcare for our boards and sponsors, our senior leaders, our associates, and our physicians, to give them the ability and the concepts to be leaders of and providers of services in a ministry within the Catholic tradition. So we give them various opportunities to experience our legacy, Catholic social teaching, organizational ethics, spirituality, and so forth. And this is our way of attempting to provide them with what they need to be business leaders, clinical leaders, and leaders of this marvelous ministry called Catholic Healthcare. And one of the things we talked to them about, and Pierre's comments reminded me of this, is we try to make distinctions between what it means to be a poor leader, an effective leader, and an inspirational leader. And what we say is that the poor leader, it's all about my story. It's all about me. The effective leader, it's all about our story. But the inspirational leader, it's all about the story. And I think what Pierre was sharing with us today was an example in a man's life of how he has been able to demonstrate the story in a very complex and challenging enterprise. And without the advantages of being a ministry, where at least theoretically there's a certain sort of spin on what we do that would suggest, oh yeah, we should be about the story. And in our tradition, the story is the gospel. It's the gospel. And our legacies, at least in Catholic healthcare, mainly has been the experiences of sisters, and talk about a global operation. Mercy's coming from Dublin, Holy Cross Sisters coming from Le Mans to the United States to provide services to people living in poverty. I mean, their legacy, which we today try to remind ourselves of as we do our work together, was based on the gospel, on doing what needed to be done, very much like the parable of the Good Samaritan. So how do we do this work together? We build upon the Catholic social thought and teachings that have been developed over the years, and combine it with a very strong emphasis on spirituality, which was another aspect of Pierre's comments that it struck me. It reminded me of a book I just read by Richard Rohr called Falling Upward. I don't know if any of you have come across it yet, but I highly recommend you read it, especially all of us graybeards in the room, because it's about the two halves of life and the two spiritualities of life. And it actually isn't that chronological when you read his book. He's really talking about how there are events in our lives where we stumble, where we fail, where we have a dramatic physical event. Maybe we have a health event that knocks us down for a bit, an illness in the family, a divorce, any number of things. And what I read in Pierre's speech to us tonight and in his written comments was that experience of that one 8-year period of time with that company that didn't work out. And it seems to me that that's really informed his work in the ensuing years, and it's really shaped his way of integrating the Christian perspective on being a business leader. It was very, very moving for me. I think that we're in a very interesting time as leaders. I'm very respectful of the challenges that face business leaders today who don't have the advantages that I do. I mean, I can go to work every day and talk about the Gospels. I can remind people who are perhaps struggling with some difficult challenge that our founders and foundresses came to this country as teenage girls and were sent off to Boise, Idaho, and got off of a stagecoach to serve a population who spoke a language they weren't even familiar with yet. To remind them that they did this without significant compensation. In fact, they had to often grow their own food and beg for the resources to create these establishments. It's kind of amazing today to go to the Mother House of the Holy Cross community or to the Sisters of Mercy in Farmington Hills, Michigan, and sit down in the cafeteria with these ladies who were on their way to being school teachers or music teachers, and were called into the parlor by Mother Superior and told, no, I want you to go to Jacksonville, Illinois, and run a hospital. Talk about succession planning. And they did it. They just went out and they did it. And today we run these complicated organizations. The themes of Pierre's paper are relevant to Catholic healthcare today. I mean, we are in the present moment at Trinity doing a discernment of whether we should outsource and, in fact, offshore some of our sort of back office work as a way of managing the significant challenges that we're facing today with healthcare reform. We have to reduce our expenses by $2.75 billion in the next 3 years. And so all these ideas are being presented for consideration by leadership in our board, including considering maybe moving some work offshore. Now, Pierre's talked about like 20 countries where you're offshoring, so to speak. I don't even think you would call it offshoring. We're having people kind of wringing their hands and wondering whether that's a good idea. I mean, our corporate offices are in Michigan, so some of the folks in Michigan get a little sensitive about moving work out of Michigan. But our sisters, global ministries as they are, have people in Bangladesh looking for work, people in India looking for work, people in Peru and Nicaragua and in Africa, where we have our sisters who founded our ministry serving in those countries. And so to try to connect those two opportunities and see that it's something that's a part of our overall legacy has just been very, very important to us. So there was just many things in his speech tonight that caused me to reflect on similarities and differences between us in terms of the challenges facing leaders of healthcare ministries and leaders in general. But I think that there's just a tremendous amount of wisdom in the document that you all received a copy of tonight. I strongly encourage you to read it and reflect upon it in your own work, whether you're on a for-profit or non-profit context, because it says that the story really is the gospel, and we operationalize it in various ways by our Catholic social thinking and teaching. So it's been great to share these observations with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation at the table.
Nora, didn't he do a good job? Great. Thank you, Dan, for your response. Pierre, Brian, and Dan have given us much to contemplate. Now at your tables, you will have the opportunity to have a conversation about some of those thoughts, as well as their relevance to your own life, your own career. I would ask the moderators at each table to grab the discussion documents. You will be using that discussion document and distill one insight or question from your table, although we will not require everyone to share this evening. Unless there are any other questions, I will ask Father Eric to come forward and join us all in prayer.
Good evening, everyone. I am honored to be here for this conversation, a conversation that has already been rich, and I'm sure will only get richer as we share around our tables. It is a lofty responsibility, leadership in our world, in business, in economics, servant leadership. And so I think it is very important that we humbly pray this evening and ask God's blessing. Lord, we give you thanks for this day and for each day, and for the opportunities we have to gather, to grow, to encourage enterprise. We're grateful for this evening, the opportunity for fellowship here, and to explore our calling, your calling in our lives, in our careers. In your wise providence, Lord, you are glad to bless all human labor, the work of our hands and of our minds. Help us to respect the dignity of each and every person, to value our environment and the common good. Grant that all who plan and conduct business may, through your guidance and your support, may come to right decisions and carry them out fairly. We ask you to bless our meal, bless our conversation. Send your Spirit among us this evening to enliven us in the ways of justice and peace. Give us wisdom, courage, and love. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Bon appetit.
All right, it's always a good sign when there is continued discussion, and we would like to blame the cheesecake and the excellent food for a late start. At this point, we would love to encapsulate those conversations out there with some questions that are from you out in the crowd. We will pose them to the panel. They will respond as they see fit, whether all three will respond or just one at a time. So I would pose it out to the group out there. Would one of you moderators like to share a question from your group? I know Mike Naughton will help me out. Mike?
Michelle, thank you. We had a very broad, ranging conversation on lots of topics, and again, very grateful to all three of you. But the one issue that we just got discussing at the end was over the question of pluralism. Particularly Dan, when you talked about the inspirational leader and who tells the story, right? And yet we live in a culture that's increasingly pluralistic, and that it's hard to, no matter where you're at, even in a faith-based institution, to even make a claim of that. And one issue that certainly, and Kyle raised this right at the end, which I thought was very helpful. Certainly, when we talk about pluralism, the one thing we should be very mindful of is that our faith should be shown in our actions. I mean, the famous line from St. Francis, preach the gospel always, use words whenever necessary. If people can't see that faith has some type of animating life force in us, for us to impose or kind of tell people, who we are, is always going to fall flat, and actually is actually the conditions for scandal for that. So that's certainly one thing, but it still doesn't get away. So that's one thing. We have to show it through your actions. And Pierre, your example of being in China, and certainly showed that type of action, and that something else is going on here besides earnings per share, as Brian mentioned. There's a different criteria, and somebody might be saying, that's interesting. I'd like to know more about that. So that was one thing. But nonetheless, we still live in a culture where there is a sense that choice is the highest. It's not the content of one's choice, but the fact that people have choices is the highest value. I was mentioning a Jewish psychologist by the name of Philip Reif, who pointed out that often people talk about having their choices, but when someone has a choice and they don't have a deep sense that they're called to something, often their choice is insignificant. If all I have is just my choice, and I don't have a vocation, I don't have a call, then I often think my choice is insignificant. So in light of all that, maybe if you could respond to anything that we just said about the question of pluralism, about how you deal with that in your situation. Pierre, obviously you're dealing with it's publicly traded company, and Dan, of course, you're dealing with that, and Brian, I think, would also have some comments.
Thanks, Michael. I'll pose it first to you, Dan. It's magic. Hold on.
Okay. Not long ago, I was sitting in a lobby of our hospital in Silver Spring, Maryland, Holy Cross Hospital. I got there early, and I kind of wanted to get a feel for the day, and I literally saw the world walking through the front door, either as a patient and family or as a caregiver. And as I later in the day asked, there were over 67 distinct ethnicities and religions represented in the workforce of this Catholic hospital, capital C, small c, Catholic hospital. And recently at our corporate offices, we had a conversation with our associates around the pluralism within the office between Jewish associates, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Catholic, had this lively conversation about why do you want to work here? What is it that calls you to being here? And you know, it's sort of like that story of the guy that went to the hot dog maker and said, "Make me one with everything." They want to be a part of an enterprise that encompasses and allows for, first of all, faith, the ability to have a meaningful path that you're following, that we as an employer or a provider are not going to impose on you. We have a ministry in Nampa, Idaho, where only 3% of the population is Catholic. 45% of the population is Latter-day Saints, Mormons. There are, and I'm, you know, Trinity is just one example out of many. The most diverse ministry within the Catholic Church is, I think, in healthcare. We serve the world with the world as servers. Our most diverse subgroups within our hospitals are the medical staff, religiously, ethnically, you know, you name it. We have someone from practically everywhere serving our patients, and so the you know, you get into the dogma, you get into, you know, some of the debates, you know, at the level of the Vatican, and you know, we do have this problem still with some people saying, you know, one true faith, but that just doesn't show up practically in our work. We just don't worry about that issue, frankly, and so we take care of people, we hire people, we require respect for diversity. We have some folks that want to use their faith as a you know, beats people over the head with it, and we just don't let them do that. You know, and the sisters were great at this. I mean, they went out to, you know, I worked in Southwest Missouri at a Mercy facility. The Mercies went out there at the end of right around the Civil War. You know, there was you could probably throw a stone in 5 different directions and not hit a Catholic. But you hit a whole lot of evangelical Christians.
Well, I'll try to keep mine a little bit brief here. My experience here at the University of St. Thomas has been a real redemptive one. I have been surrounded by people and the various institutes that encourage me to reach down deep in my own faith tradition, not just for my own good, but it genuinely enriches my students, my colleagues. This is speaking. I've learned this from Michael Naughton about speaking from the center, but when you experience it happening, it's just overwhelming, and the sense of gratitude and grace is phenomenal. So, to conclude, we want to encourage people in organizations to reach into their own faith or other traditions. Not all of them are theologically based. It's like roots that feed and cultivate the flowers. If we cut off the roots, the flowers will look good for a period of time and then they'll wilt.
When you run a company, and particularly in different countries, you are obviously exposed to a vast variety of beliefs. I have company and factories with Muslims, with Buddhists, with Catholics, with whatever. So we don't. And being a French company on top of it, for those who knows French and the relationship between the French society and religion is a little bit difficult. We have this laïcism type of things where you're not supposed to, or more specifically, religion has to be a personal thing and not a public thing. So you have also by law to have to be a little bit careful. But so we don't position ourselves as a Christian company, obviously. I'm just happen to be a Christian CEO, that's all, running a company. But because of my engagements in different activities, everybody knows my faith. And that has allowed me, in many countries, in fact, to have discussions on the subject that I would never have had otherwise. In China, I had a meeting with a man who is running the Communist Party school where they train all their leaderships, 6,000 people being trained. And their clear objective is to say, we want to train our people to be the best in the world, Chinese way. But I'm interested in what you are, and what is UNIAPAC, and what you do, and how can you run a business and be a Christian? And it was an interesting discussion indeed, to the point where they want me to go and have a speech in China. I'm not sure I will do it, but so yes, the fact that they know what you believe in leads you to have contact and discussion you would never have otherwise, even with my own people or people outside.
Thank you. And speaking from the center, I like that. Questions out here? There's a couple. Yeah, that'd be great, Mike. Ken? Bob? With background music?
How appropriate. So we were talking a lot about the structure of work, and about the on the one hand, Catholic social thought emphasizes the dignity of work itself, but also how work is structured is really important. And work can be done, work can be structured so that it's just grinding toil, or it can be structured in a way that engages people, your whole self. And so there's really kind of a tension there about work as labor is a good thing, but labor can also be a grind. And we were struck by your first illustration, Pierre, about working in the factory yourself, and about how that really informed your whole career as starting at sort of at the ground floor in looking at things, whether it was the factory in China, but your own experience as having worked literally in the shit, and then the kind of way that formed you to pay attention.
I think as human beings, we are very much formatted by the experience we have when we are an adolescent. And I really think that when you are between 12 to 25, they are very formatting years. The experience you have during that period will stay with you for your whole life. And I personally encourage all the young people I know to take jobs, summer jobs, whatever, on the floor, because the experience they will gain if they open their eyes will stay with them for the rest of their life. And I think that's absolutely critical. And probably education systems is not insisting on that enough, or not organizing themselves enough in relationship with the business community to do it. I think that will be a major challenge to have our youngsters to really know what's going on the floor. You don't need to spend years. A couple of weeks. If you open your eyes, you see a lot of things.
Thank you. And I'll say to the panelists, with our background music, we can speak even louder to hear you back here. Anything back here? Dan.
So we had a wonderful conversation here that started off with some discussion around the comment that if you respect people, you demand much of them, which led us to contemplate a little bit on how Jesus modeled that for us, in the sense that Jesus wasn't easy on folks, and he told them the truth, and then they got to choose, right? You either grow or you leave and walk away. And so as organizations face the real pressures and the real need to make a profit and to do the things that create a strong business that's sustainable. It seems the question of intent that underlies that notion of how you make that profit, like what is the intent that is driving the organization, is really important. And that when you're in good times, that's pretty easy to hold that up and talk about it and sing about it. And then when you get in tough times, how does that intent, that holds that counterbalance to the need for profit that makes that work experience and that whole organization successful in the full sense of that word? How do you hold that intent in ways that are concrete and real, that can be useful to leaders trying to navigate that today?
It's not easy. I was standing at the table. I'm in the automotive industry, and as you know, the automotive industry, particularly in this country, went down to a very serious crisis back in 2008 and 2009. End of March 2009, looking at my numbers, I was 50% down in volume worldwide. As you know, I've been told, I've been to the business school at Harvard. We had probably 1,000 cases in 2 years. I never seen a case where a CEO was in front of a volume down 50% versus last year. And clearly, we had to take the measures for survival of the company. And I did immediately take the decision to shut down a couple of factories and to lay off people. And that's what I was referring to when I say you reach your limits. At one point, reality, it's a principle also. Principle of reality is also a principle of the church, Saint Thomas d'Aquin, I think. And you have to face reality, and your responsibility is to act and to take tough decisions when you have to take them. The only thing is then, when those decisions are taken, is how you implement them. One of the rules we have tried to always live up to is when we fire people is to help them to find a new job at the same pay. And people tell you, how can you do it? If everybody is firing people, well, unemployment is a flow. There's an entrance and it's a flow, coming in and coming out. If you help your people, they will just come out faster than the others. And we have a rule that every time we lay off or we shut down a factory, the whole company organizes itself and help locally the people to find a job. And at the end of the process, every 2 weeks, they come to my office and we review the name of the people that have not found a job yet. I cannot do anything myself, but the fact that the whole organization knows that I'm looking at it forces the organization to act. Is it perfect? No. Is it successful 100%? No. But at least the intent is there to do it. But the principle of reality has to be there. As I said, as a CEO, I can have an ideal. I cannot be an idealist. I have to live up to the reality. So that's one example, but I could develop.
The other day I got asked to lead a conversation with our finance division. And they didn't really give me any direction. They said, come in and do something that will engage us and inspire us. So I picked the parable of the talents to engage them in a conversation about what does it mean? What is the story about these three guys that got different levels of resources? And the story. One of them went out and doubled them. The other guy went out and doubled his, and then the one guy buried it. And it's a very interesting response in terms of Jesus is a commentary on it that he's really being messaging some of the things that Pierre said about you got to deliver. You got to deliver the goods. If you've got certain things that you've been gifted with, you better use them. And I don't know if any of you have read the quote on the back of the program from John Henry Cardinal Newman. But I think he's making the same point in a way that we've all been given an assignment. We've all been given a gift that if we don't use it, something doesn't happen in this world. And in business or in healthcare, we've been gifted with remarkable resources that we are, I think, called upon to use in some fashion, or one of those levels of conscience is going to show up that Pierre was talking about and haunt us.
I think there's an additional problem that middle ground between laying people off because if we do so, we'll have higher profits, shareholders will be happier, the stock price will go up, and we'll pay bigger dividends, versus the survival of the organization. But there's a gray area in between there. How do we sincerely convince people to understand that, A, the organization is there to be for the employees to the best of its abilities, and B, that in this particular case, when we have to engage in layoffs, it's because we really tried all of the other viable alternatives that we could possibly conceive. And there's also a third point. If management, from my understanding with interviews with a CEO in this audience, is the executive able to discern when he or she has possibly made mistakes, or CEOs before them? If employees understand that we sometimes make mistakes, I'm sorry, it didn't work out, it might be a little bit easier, at least to take it, even though being laid off is a tragedy for the family.
Thanks, Brian. Something else?
We talked also about the challenges of living out our faith in the workplace, in the world around us, and in a pluralistic workplace and world. And I appreciate your response earlier about pluralism. And I'm wondering, I'm an ordained Protestant clergy, and I believe the more that we can do together, the more we can get done. So I was wondering if you could give your thoughts on what we can do to not only tolerate people who have different beliefs, but actually combine efforts and work together. What do you see needs to happen in the business world to foster more collaboration?
Great question. Dan, can you start us off?
Well, you would think that, in my role I would hire or be promoting Catholics to be mission leaders of Catholic healthcare ministries, but I don't actually agree with that. I think I agree with where you're going with your question, which is that we're stronger, we're actually more Catholic, and we're more aligned with the gospel message. You think about, the disciples that went out after Jesus was off the scene and went out to all these different peoples. There was a great openness to a variety of different ways. And I think some of my most Catholic mission leaders, and in our system, some of our most Catholic leaders are actually not Catholic. They have this remarkable appreciation for the Catholic tradition, and they don't have any Catholic wounds. And so they live out their appreciation for the tradition in ways that are really new to those of us who were, born Catholic and raised Catholic and so forth. And I think that truly does honor the message of the gospel.
It helps, I think, to also foster a dialogue, an open, explicit dialogue, interreligious dialogue. Mike Naughton and I have been able to do that in our theology class for seniors here, where each of us has learned something from the other, and we put it into practice. We model it with our students, and they learn how to do the same. So I think a lot of it also is dialogue, the openness to talk through the differences, to understand the sources of disagreements, but also some of the commonalities, and to reach some kind of consensus, kind of from a solidarity perspective on common goals. But that's all I have to say.
Just one example, when, as I mentioned, at Energy was a consequence of merger, we had to develop this program, which we built on the international specificity of the company. It evolved to try to formalize the values that we would share. And again, 20 different nationalities. One of the values, for example, was respect of the person. Now, respect of the person doesn't mean the same thing if you are French, if you are Japanese, or if you have an Indian. And the way we kind of addressed that was to go from the values to the behavior. What are the behaviors in specific conditions in the company that you would see as meeting the values we are proposing? We were proposing the respect of the person. What does it mean in terms of behavior? And having that done in group, multicultural group, help those people to understand each other. I had Japanese who were explaining to a French or an English or a Western people that, for example, respect of the people in Japanese is much more linked to the community and the group in which you belong, much less individualistic than in our Western world. Having those discussions helps the people to understand each other and have a better dialogue with them. A second example is what we're doing at UNIAPAC. We've engaged over the last 5 years a dialogue with Muslim executives, up to the point where 2 weeks from now we're organizing a big conference in Beirut where we will have 300 executives from both cultural origin meeting in Beirut for 2 days on the issue of management and the place of the person in management. Just the fact that we had this group in Beirut working for the last 5 years, a small group first, and larger now, working on, again, practical the problems of the company discussed among practitioners for practical solution in the company, but help getting the people to go up to why they would do that compared to their own beliefs and values has helped a lot in the understanding and sharing why I'm doing that, because I'm referring to my own faith, which is Catholic, and the other one because I'm a Muslim and reading the Quran led me to believe in that, helps to a dialogue that you would never have otherwise. And that's also a way to get people to better accept each other because they understand the roots of each other. It doesn't mean we have to convince each other.
We have 2 more questions, so I'm going to actually have both questions asked, and then I ask the presenters to respond.
Thank you again for a wonderful discussion. My question is for Mr. Lecocq. There tends to be a particular kind of trend right now among businesses, certainly with our great ability to advertise their charity and how charitable they are, often with an incentive for us to buy their product. I mean, you go to Starbucks and written on the side of a coffee is that your coffee paid for something in Africa to help children out, something like this. I wonder if you might speak about how, I mean, in the reflection it says that the business leaders to be in solidarity with the poor. How ought a business show that? In the Gospels it talks about, it's often pointed out that it's done in secret. It's done something, don't expect anything, only do it that your Heavenly Father sees it, but a business is something public. So I wonder if you might speak about that. Thank you.
And Pierre, just one more question, and then we'll let you both respond.
We were having a conversation about a tendency in many large organizations for the CEO to be both CEO and chairman of the board and to be regarded as something of a rock star in his organization. And the attendant isolation that comes from that because people hold them in such high esteem and are sometimes reluctant to challenge them, can put them in a position where they really are isolated and don't even know it. So our question is are there ways in which, must we just wait and pray for the conversion of the CEO who decides, yes, I do need to be more involved and more vulnerable and more humble in my relationships with my organization? Or are there ways in which we as members of those organizations can influence upward and help them to become more connected with the organization they serve?
That's a tough one. The first one about charity. I know in the U.S., American culture is very much oriented towards charities. On that, I would have a relatively clear position. Business is not about philanthropy, and we should not confuse things. Business is about creating values and making profit, let's face it. Now, as a person, what I want to do with the money I earn and the charity I want to support is another thing. But I personally, in my company, the company doesn't give any money for a charity. I don't think this is the responsibility of a company. And I think in some of the example you're giving, I also feel bad about the way some company would instrumentalize their charity for a purpose which is not the charity. So I think this is a very, very difficult thing. In any way, I'm not saying it should be a general rule, but personally, I think a company is not a philanthropic organization. As a person, a shareholder, manager, whatever, what he does with his money is his own responsibility, and I would personally give to charities, but not my company. I think we have to maintain clear differentiation from, because otherwise you get very, very rapidly into instrumentalizing, is that English, what you're doing. Now, in terms of how within, if I understand correctly, your question is how within the organization can you convert your CEO? Difficult. I think the best thing is everyone within the organization has to live up to what he's really convinced of. And again, being conscious that what you do eventually has to generate efficiency. Again, and I was not a CEO all my life. I started as a young engineer and then as a manager and so on. And I'm probably getting older, lived up differently, but I didn't try to convince my CEO. I just tried to live up to what I was personally willing to live up in the responsibility I was given. And apparently I got the result enough, so I was promoted to the next job. And then I could have a larger influence. Again, when I started my career, I never thought I would have the career I had. But I knew I wanted to be a plant manager to fix the issue I had seen when I was a worker working in those factories. And then when I did it as a plant manager, apparently I got the kind of result that got me promoted to the next job, which eventually became a CEO. But trying to convert your CEO, I'm not sure that's the right way to do it.
Dan, does that make you nervous?
What?
Being converted?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, just one comment about the charity activities of a business. Like Catholic healthcare is a nonprofit, right? And we're supposed to give back to the community. And so we provide charity care. I have a problem with that idea because I don't actually think we give charity. I think we take charity. And we take it from the business community that basically pays us more than the cost of the care we provide. And we take some of that money and underwrite the cost of care that nobody's paying for. So you have to be really careful. It's sort of like Starbucks in the sense that we just give them $3 for a $1 cup of coffee and they give 25 cents to somebody in Africa. That's very nice of them, but they're taking charity too.
Another take on the charity dimension. Yes, there's a problem with window dressing and what we call dramaturgy, play acting, to create a certain perception. And Irving Goffman in sociology talked about this at length many decades ago. But I think there is a place for charity, particularly when we can tie it in with a good narrative about what are we trying to do with our employees to encourage them to reach down into their spiritual roots and develop solidarity relations with one another in a sort of a team. Well, we might send our employees at company expense to do something like Habitat for Humanity in another country. So I think that there is potentially a place for charity. Then lastly, on the Jeannie's question about CEOs, there's a literature out there on the managerial hubris where the media fawning after CEOs and popping them up. There's actually an institutional problem here. From an institutional level, we're creating structures whereby people actually start to believe what's written about them. That this is a problem. I'm not going to have I don't have an answer tonight, but it's being recognized as a problem. But it's going to require an institutional fix as well as at a high level, as opposed to just at the organizational level.
Thank you, all of you. I would ask all of you, as a business leader, as a student, am I promoting human dignity and the common good in my sphere of influence? Am I supporting the culture of life, of justice, international regulations, transparency, civic, environmental, and labor standards, and fight against corruption? Am I promoting the integral development of the person in my workplace? Those questions were asked in the document that you had in front of you tonight. We hope these questions and some of the messages from the evening will stimulate discussions in your businesses, in your homes, and in your classrooms, helping business leaders, faculty, and students to see, judge, and act as servant leaders. As the gentleman beside me said tonight, the chief is made servant, and I think as inspirational leaders, we create the story. I would like to give these inspirational leaders a small token of our appreciation. If you could join me in clapping for them. I don't believe we are like Starbucks, but we are giving you a wardrobe so you will walk around with St. Thomas on your chest. We have a beautiful jacket here. Brian and Pierre. They will be wearing them outside later. Thank you all for sharing your evening with us. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did.